Well, I've been taking pictures for a long time. I think it is one of the most extraordinary things that one can do with one's life. It's a very privileged life, to be honest. I was going to be a French teacher in Texas, where nobody cares at all to learn French, and probably marry an insurance salesman. Nothing wrong with insurance salesmen, mind you, but I just thought I would probably have a pretty normal life. But I should have known better, because I was raised by my mother. I was an only child raised by a single parent, and my mother was a very eccentric scientist. And so I grew up very poor, but my mother made sure that I had a very cultured life, and what we lacked in money, we were very rich in music and dance and acting and all kinds of things like that. And I think in the end that really did shape my life and sort of fed into my fantasies. You know, when you grow up alone, you sort of create your own world, because you are alone so much of the time. It never bothered me. In fact, I have a very active fantasy life to this day because of it. But I think it is something that really had a huge impact on my life, because there was never anybody saying, no, you can't dream that, that's not possible for you. In fact, my mother was always encouraging me to think that I could do just about anything I wanted to, within reason, of course. But and I think this is important. We've talked a lot this week in our wonderful masterclass about dreaming, having dreams, and also about being practical. And I think in the end, that's maybe life is a balance of those two things. And balance has been the theme of our class this week. I think it's been so extraordinary because, in fact, everybody, all the students in the class are sort of looking for some balance in their lives. And you'll see their work later, but I thought it was a particularly interesting and prophetic theme for them. Speaking of balance, I just wanted to say a couple of things about it. And that is that I think that convention is important, as long convention being conventional, or having convention in your work, or having a practical side is very important, as long as it fits a social function. But I also think it's something to break, and especially when it holds us back and insists that we conform. And I wanted to mention that because, again, the theme of this week has been balance. We do lead this very privileged life that is paid for, we photographers, paid for by angst and insecurity, but made richer by the things that we see and we experience. So I think when you think about balance, there's the convention and the idea of when to break it. There's ego versus a genuine interest and curiosity and desire to tell stories and witness things and document that. And there's the pure wonder of the world as a child might see it, versus a sort of healthy cynicism that one develops over time. So I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more. So I went to school in Austin, Texas. That's where I'm from. And I worked my way through school. And so when I graduated with a degree in journalism, I moved to Paris for 3 months because I didn't really have a chance to really take a lot of pictures in school, working as I was. And for 3 months I wandered around the streets of Paris, and I thought I was Cartier-Bresson, and that's the kind of picture I was taking. And I had a very, again, sort of maybe too dreamy view of what a photographer's life could be about. But I also really tried to use the time to build a portfolio. And then I went back to Texas, and I got a job on a little tiny paper in Galveston, Texas. And I was a reporter photographer for about 9 months. And I'm not really much of a small town gal, so I decided I would go to New York City and seek my fortune. And I was very lucky because at the time, Associated Press had no women picture editors, and that makes me sound really ancient, but it wasn't that long ago. So I applied for a job and I got it. And I was the only woman picture editor, and I also was the youngest person on the staff. And boy, did I get beaten up by a lot of photographers. But I remember running to the darkroom. There was one photographer in particular who used to be so mean to me, and I would run to the darkroom. Remember those? Run to the darkroom and cry because it hurt my feelings so much, but I was never going to let this man see me cry, you know. So anyway, I finally got a little bit tougher. But this was the days, even though it wasn't that long ago, I like to say, it was the days when you could still smoke in the office, and you could tell a good news day from a bad news day according to how many cigars the supervising editor would smoke. And there were still bottles of liquor in the bottom drawer. You know, it was kind of like pretty sort of, I don't know, interesting, I guess is the best way to describe it. Anyway, and I loved being a picture editor. I could have been a picture editor for the rest of my life. I still thrill in looking at other people's pictures. I think it's the most extraordinary thing to think that there's this little frame and that every damn person who looks to it sees something different. I can't get over it. To this day, I cannot get over it. I am so impressed and so thrilled by it, and I'm so in love with it. And to be honest, it is the thing that keeps me in photography, because this is not an easy life, and you make a lot of choices, and you lose sometimes many more things than you gain, but the things that you gain are so magical and precious and profound that, you know, and one of them is this constant sort of surprise at how people see the world and how they bring it to us, to show it to us. So anyway, while I was at AP as a picture editor, I became very interested in Africa, and I was trying to get the AP to send me to Africa to be the picture editor for Africa, because there weren't any picture editors. And they just wouldn't do it, so I finally quit and I went to cover a war. And this was a war in Rhodesia, a guerrilla war, which is now, Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe. And I covered that war for a couple of years, and I worked a lot for the New York Times. I used to develop my film in a bathroom, and then I would clip negatives that I wanted to send to them and write captions, and we would send a little air freight package. It's funny to think about it now. It was so basic, and anyway. But it was a lot of fun, and the New York Times had some very good correspondents there, so they ran 3 or 4 stories a week, and so 3 or 4 times a week I would have a little picture in the New York Times, and I joined SIPA Press, which was a French picture agency. And I started working, and I worked there for a couple of years until the end of the war. And then I returned to New York City, and I started freelancing. And I must say it was sort of returning to New York that I realized that I didn't really want to be a news photographer, because I came back after 2 years, and the way I covered that war was, it wasn't a war that you could really get to the front lines at, because it was a race war, and it was very dangerous. And so the more interesting story to me was the fact that the society was changing, that there was a real flight of the Anglos, of the Europeans, and so the whole society and the structure of the society was changing. And I really think that's a more interesting way to cover war, is to look at how society changes or look at the aftermath of war, because otherwise, you know, really, when you get right down to it, I think we should document war, but at some point, war photography can end up being a lot of pictures of dead bodies and violence. What I think is more important, if we want it to really be effective and to bring to light the reasons for war, is to look at what happens before and what happens afterwards. At least that's my philosophy. At any rate, I realized that I didn't want to be a news photographer, because yesterday's news was not going to move me to tomorrow's, and that I really wanted to tell stories. So I started doing little stories, and I was just paying for them myself. And so in order to pay for them, I became a paparazzi for 3 months. And that was just the worst experience of my life. I think I really felt like gum on the bottom of somebody's shoe. And my work day would begin at 12 midnight, and it would go until 5 or 6 in the morning. But I was very lucky because when I was at Associated Press, I had met this paparazzo named Felice Cuento. Felice Cuento was one of the original paparazzi in La Dolce Vita by Federico Fellini. So he was in the movie, and he was a very gruff Italian man, and you wouldn't believe the pictures that he got. I swear he was in the mafia or something, because he could really come back with some incredible pictures. But he used to take me under his wing and get me into these clubs, and I would work all night. But I only did that for a few months, because really it wasn't my cup of tea at all, and nor how I wanted to spend my life. But I made a little bit of money. And so then I started going to Cuba. And I went to Cuba between 82 and 85, 1982 and 85, about 40 times. And I would say in Cuba is where I really learned how to be a photographer. That is not work I ever show, because it is so young. And but because most of the time I was going on my own dime, I could make a lot of mistakes. And I could learn. But I would use that work to take and show to magazines when I thought it was good enough. And little by little, I was able to start working for magazines. And in fact, I had a very lucky thing happen, which with Newsweek, because it was the 25th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. And I had been going to show Newsweek this bad Cuba work for some time. And they decided to really give me a break. And so they sent me with a writer to Cuba for a month. And this writer happened to be the UN bureau chief for Newsweek. And she had worked for 1.5 years to get an interview with Castro. And she ended up being the only foreign journalist to get an interview with Fidel Castro. And so the magazine ran it as was. It was the longest interview with anybody, any foreign dignitary, and they ran a lot of pictures, and they got a lot of very angry Cubans in Miami canceling their subscriptions. But Castro himself was so delighted that he took her by one arm and me by the other, and for a full day we drove around the Sierra Maestra mountains looking at projects, and at the end of the day we went to a private barbecue with Gabriel Garcia Marquez and some other dignitaries, and Fidel Castro held court and the UN bureau chief held court, and they let me take pictures, and I had a lot of very funny pictures, and those were published in Paris Match as well, in a very, like a 10-page spread. And so I had a lot of good luck with Cuba in the end. But I was really missing Africa. And somebody said to me, you know, you should go to Haiti, because Haiti is just like Africa. And so, in fact, I did go, and in fact, it was just like Africa. It was as though some large bird had flown over Africa and plucked a piece of land and somehow dropped it into the Caribbean Sea, and there it was, the most African nation of the Caribbean nations. And so I started working there quite a bit, even until now. And that was really starting in 1986 and up until now. Not as frequently, but I've worked extensively there. And so I've had a pretty nice career. I've worked for a lot of different magazines, doing a lot of different stories. And I've worked a lot through picture agencies. I worked for 5 different agencies, none of which are around in their original context, and that's just something that's going on in the business. But the reason that I stayed in photography was because I really am fascinated by what we get to see. I also decided that I wanted to do a lot of things with photography, and so I kept my hand in picture editing, because again, I'm so thrilled by what I get to see through other people's eyes. And I've been teaching a lot as well, because I think after you learn so much and garner so much from your experiences, it's really quite a pleasant experience to see young people like little kittens. And I've been calling the students little this and little that, little pea pods and little, I don't know, little everything. Little muffins, little what? Yeah, everything little. But the truth is, it's just out of affection, because I really love to teach, and again, so I'm quite happy to be teaching here. So I think we should just look at the work, and I'd like to talk to you about it as we go along, because really that's why you're here, I think, to see the work. So I wanted to start with this work in Haiti. Oh, I get to drive. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. So Haiti, I guess we can't bring these lights down, can we? No. Okay. So Haiti. I love Haiti. You know, Haiti is an extraordinary place that really is, after working there for quite some time, I realized that this was where the fates pointed to and said, aha, this is where we shall put the portal between heaven and hell. And everything fits into that sort of balance. Everything is either complete hell or complete heaven. Complete extremes. There is no in between. And I can't quite say why I'm so compelled or drawn to the Haitian people, except by way of their courage. They're very brave people. They're very smart people. They don't have the benefit of education so much, but they're very intellectual. They're great artists, and their art is in literature and in painting and music, and even in the way that they set things on a table. It's always in a very altar-like fashion. I had a lot of good luck with Haiti, because this picture is the one that won the World Press, first prize in Spot News in World Press. And in fact, it's what took me to Haiti. In 1985, I read one of those small pieces in the New York Times about food riots going on in Haiti, and I knew that that was a fairly strange thing to happen. Because of the Tonta-Macoute, the secret police, and everything was very oppressive. So I went to Haiti, and sure enough, there were food riots all over the place, and I was covering them. And one day, after a lot of demonstrations, the Haitians ran over to a food warehouse that was owned by CARE, which is an organization, a relief organization. And they covered it like ants on a piece of candy and took the food out. And you could just stay in one place and turn 360 degrees. And there were so many things going on. And one is sort of in the middle of this turmoil and feeling invisible when one isn't really, but you know, a lot of things were going on. And I didn't even know I had taken this picture, to be honest, but I did. And what I love about this picture is, well, is the same thing that I sort of have disdain about it for. And I mean, to me, this photograph really describes Haiti, and so many countries where the police and the army, the secret police, the government, maybe the gangsters, the drug lords, all of these people who are in control, and the people who are suffering from that control, which are the people, the poor people in Haiti's case, because Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere and one of the 5 poorest countries in the world. So to me, this really described Haiti, but it also describes Haiti on some sort of ephemeral level too, because in Haiti, voodoo is as widespread a religion. There's a saying that in Haiti, it is 100%, 85% Catholic and 100% voodoo. And everybody practices voodoo in some sense, even if they don't sort of acknowledge it. So this big post that you see here is like in a voodoo temple, there's a potomitan, it's a pole, and it's how the spirits enter our world. And behind the post, there's something going on, which I've never quite figured out. And then this soldier coming into the frame with the baton. At the same time that he was slicing through the air with it, it was as though he sliced through my life before this picture and my life after this picture. Because when this picture won the awards, everything in my career changed. And I comment on it only because I have actually a lot of disdain for awards, even though I've been very honored to receive a number of them. And I think, partly I think it's because I think if the work is good enough, it shouldn't have to gain attention, it shouldn't have to be somehow confirmed by an exterior panel of some nature. But also because then I think sometimes we work too much for those things and not the sort of thing that we should work for. Anyway, that changed my career, that picture. And I started working in Haiti. A week after this picture was taken, the Duvalier regime, which was a 30-year dictatorship, fell, and the Duvaliers left. And then there was this real struggle to move toward a democratic form of government. And as the elections were organized, there started to be a lot of demonstrations, and every night there would be shooting, and every morning the journalists would go out and we would find 20, 30, 40 bodies in the streets. And we were photographing a lot of funerals. In fact, funeral met funeral at the church doors. And finally, election day came, and this was November 1987, and 1 hour after the polls opened, they were closed again, and there were terrible massacres at the polling stations, and the ballots were burned, and the elections were called off. And there was a great deal of violence that day. Journalists were killed and attacked, and many, many, many Haitians were killed and attacked, and it was a terrible thing. But I covered Haiti quite a bit during those periods of great violence and turmoil, but I realized at some point that it was a very unfair depiction of the country, and that it was very important that I go in times of peace, because in fact Haiti was a very beautiful country and very magical, and that the only way that I could again create a balance was to go in those times. And so I did start to go in those times, and I did discover some really remarkable moments, and I learned a lot about Haiti from the people, and I learned to speak Creole, and I was really mesmerized by that. Haiti is a very magical place. As I mentioned before, voodoo really looms large. You know, Haiti was a slave colony. It was the richest colony in France's crown in the 1600s. It was completely covered with rainforest, and it was very beautiful. And so the French came, and there was some fighting between the French and the Spanish over Haiti, but the French prevailed, and they started to cut down the trees to build armada and to their ships and to send back to Europe. And they were very cruel masters. And there's a lot written about the treatment of slaves in general in the Caribbean, some really devastating things. They were so cruel that little by little the slaves started to plan a revolution. And they did it under the guise of voodoo, because one of the things that the French masters allowed the slaves to do was to retain their religions, which they brought from Africa, which was voodoo. And so they would have these voodoo ceremonies, which included drumming. And so one plantation of slaves would drum to the next plantation of slaves, and this is how they planned and then executed their revolution. And they became the first black republic in the world in 1804. But because it was a time when the world economy was based on slavery, everything poised and was positioned because of slavery, the whole world turned its back on Haiti. And so Haiti retained its culture, its very African culture. And so even now to this day, there is voodoo. And it's a very important religion that's quite misunderstood, because we sort of tend to think of it as black magic, but in fact it's not so different from Catholicism, where you have the worship of, instead of saints, of spirits. this is one of my favorite voodoo pictures, mainly because of the experience I had. I loved to go into the cemeteries and photograph. In fact, when you're working on a long-term project, I think it's very easy to get lost, and so you sometimes have to work on themes. And I was working very much on the theme of death, especially because it was so prevalent in Haiti, and I was really trying to understand and grapple with it. So I was walking in I was strolling through the cemetery one day, and there was this voodoo ceremony going on, and in every Haitian cemetery there's a big cross, and the cross is not to Christ, but to Baron Samedi, who is the god of death, the spirit of death. And so they have ceremonies there. And so I waited with my little camera poised until the voodoo priest sort of nodded at me. He recognized that I was there, and that sort of gave me permission. So I was photographing. And finally the man who was having the voodoo ceremony left, and the voodoo priest, who was possessed by Baron Samedi, the god of death, came over to me, and he took me into his arms and started dancing with me. Now, the dance for the Baron Samedi is the dance of copulation, and that's a lot of bumping and grinding. And and I find when you're in these situations, you just go with them. So he danced me around the cross, and then we stopped. And I always wear a little shirt and a little skirt or trousers, something very simple and cool. And I had some money in my little shirt pocket, and so he pulled my little pocket open and took some money, tipped his hat, and then he was gone like that. And I mean, he almost disappeared before my eyes. So I love that picture because of the experience. Anyway. Yeah. But the more time I spent in Haiti, the more I really realized that as much as I wanted to show what was going on in Haiti and was compelled to show what was going on in Haiti, I couldn't do it and still remain sort of apart from it. And Haiti is like this, it sucks you in. And I wanted to read something to you that really describes my situation in Haiti. And I think for any photographer or journalist who works there, about Haiti. Two things are certain. The first is that Haiti is a place filled with lessons. It chooses you because there is something you need to learn. It is a living parable, a Shakespearean epic in which you are supposed to participate, and the experience changes your life forever. The second thing is that whatever you think you know about Haiti amounts to nothing. Actually, anyone who is not Haitian can never really know Haiti or completely understand it. Non-Haitians like me stand with our noses pressed up against the glass window, able to look inside but unable to enter, no matter how much we fool ourselves to the contrary, no matter how much, no matter how great our desire. At best, we can offer ourselves up as a conduit, as a platform, which gives voice to a people whose cries compose a song of survival. So, Haiti still figures very large in my life, and I still continue to work there. I've done a lot of different stories in black and white and color, and I've become very involved with a lot of people there. I think sometimes I may get into trouble for this, but one becomes a journalist to witness, to observe, and to document. And then there's this sort of debate that goes on about how involved one should become in a place or with people. Well, I'm sort of the school that I can't just do that. That's not enough for me. And it's not something I always talk about because, not because I would be criticized, because really I don't really care too much what people think. I'm old enough now to say that. But because I never want to make it about me. It's really not about me. And it's not about any of us. As photographers and journalists, in my opinion, it's not about us. It should never be about us. It should never be about the photograph. It should always, always, always be about the people in the pictures and the event in the pictures and all of these things. That's just my point of view, but I feel very strongly about it. So it's very hard for me to be involved with Haiti and not help a woman with 5 children build a house, or to send children to school, or to put a woman who's dying of tuberculosis into a hospital, or to buy a legless beggar a wheelchair. And I want to tell you the story of the legless beggar, and then we'll move on to another bit of work, because it goes back to this lesson that we always learn, and this lesson that Haiti has to teach us. I was driving down the street in Haiti one day, and I saw a man with legs that had been cut off at his knees, and he walked on his hands and knees on blocks of wood. And I drove past him, and I couldn't stand it. I just couldn't stand it. I thought, well, I won't say what I said, but I just thought, this country, you know, it can't seem to get a foot up. So I stopped, I backed up, and I opened the car door, and I said, you know, in Creole, which I speak, can I give you a lift somewhere? And so he got into the car, and we were talking, and then I said, don't you have a wheelchair or something? And he said, no. And so I was just worn out from having, you know, been working 2 or 3 weeks very steadily. And I decided, okay, we have to get this man a wheelchair. And we went to several different places, and people wanted a lot of money for the wheelchair, and I had like $40 in my pocket. And so we went to the last place, and I got down on my hands and knees, and I begged this man to sell us a wheelchair for $40. And I just begged him and begged him. And he finally said, okay. And it was a used wheelchair. And there were hundreds of wheelchairs in this place. It seems like he would have been happy to get rid of one. So we put it in the car, and I drove the man home. And when we got to his house was on top of a hill. And I said, well, now, how are we going to get the wheelchair up and down, you know, every day? And he said, well, no, don't worry, because these friends who live right here in this little store will take care of the wheelchair for me. So I said, okay. And then about a week or so later, I was driving down the street, and I saw the man, the beggar, again, and he was walking on his blocks. So I stopped, and I got out of the car, and I said, whoa, where's your wheelchair? What happened? And he said, well, my friends in the store sold it, and stole it and sold it. And so I'm back to where I was. And I thought, you know, every time I try to do something in Haiti, I always end up back to where I was. And I think, I don't quite know what that lesson is yet, but it hasn't ever deterred me from trying to do something in Haiti. And again, I'm not trying to be an activist or anything, but I just feel like I take something and I have to give something back. I have to keep the balance of what I'm doing. Anyway, the very interesting thing about slaves and countries that were based on slavery is that I think their history is very tied in with Native Americans in the New World. And because, of course, when the Europeans first came to this world, to the New World, there were a lot of Native people, both in South and North America. And for some reason, when the Europeans tried to enslave them, the Indians simply wouldn't be enslaved. They either died of the diseases that they were exposed to, or they died of a broken heart. And so I always thought somehow that the fate of Native people and the fate of slaves was sort of tied together. And I always was very interested in Native Americans. So I've been photographing them for about 10 or 15 years. And I'm very confused by this work for a couple of reasons. And I think it's important to talk about being confused as a photographer, because I think it's a very confusing thing we do as well. And that is that I decided that, well, you know, there are these very beautiful pictures by Edward Curtis of Native people in North America, these very dreamy, sort of heroic Native in traditional things, costumes and clothing, and in their villages and in their daily lives. And I think people got stuck thinking about those images as representing Native people even into today. And so I wanted to photograph Indians to sort of show that there was more to them than feathers. And so that's sort of been my purpose. But I haven't wanted to ignore the fact that there are people wearing feathers, because that's part of the culture. So this is where I get very confused. But this, in fact, was a very good friend of mine, Chief Henry, who was a full-blood Cherokee, and he lived in Cherokee, North Carolina. Now, the Cherokee people never wore feathers. This is a Plains Indian headdress. They had turbans, actually. But Chief Henry put 6 kids through college doing what he calls chiefing. And chiefing is when you are dressed up like an Indian and you pose with tourists for pictures for like $5 a pop. And I have to say, he put 6 kids through college chiefing. And so I was photographing him for a story I was doing for National Geographic, and I took him up to the Great Smoky National Park, and this French lady saw him and squealed with delight and ran over and kissed him. And luckily I was ready, so anyway. But I'm trying to photograph Native people in a way. This is a young Arapaho filmmaker, Chris Iyer, who had premiered a film at a Native American Film Festival, and it had received a standing ovation, and this was the cast, you know, celebrating afterwards. But so, and I really love it when young Native people who are having such a struggle, because they're very isolated and they have a lot of problems in this isolation, with a lot of problems that a lot of young people everywhere have, which you know, with the drugs and alcohol and that sort of thing. But there's a real renaissance across the United States in terms of young Native people trying to come back to understand some traditional ways of life and understanding and belief. And so these were young Apaches, for example, who were learning the crown dance, which used to be a very secretive dance, and nobody ever got to see it. And here's a Chief Arvil Looking Horse who lives in a very traditional way. He's a spiritual leader. He always dresses in the Plains Indian clothing, because he is a full-blood Lakota Sioux, and he raises his family this way. Marie Randall, another full-blood Lakota Indian who's a spiritual, cultural advisor to the tribal government. I loved these young people because they looked like Romeo and Juliet, and they were so modern and beautiful. I met them at a fair. And you know, you've always heard about cowboys and Indians. Well, here they are. Anyway, as I really spent a lot of time photographing Native people, and along the way I met this family called the Wildcats. And these are full-blood Cherokee people who live in Oklahoma. And I started photographing them, and I've been photographing them for 10 or 15 years. I love these people. They are very poor people, but they are the richest people I know. And they have really taken me into their family. And this was at Thanksgiving with the newest member of the family. They're sort of dreamers. They live in this very traditional way. They go to schools and talk about what it's like to be an Indian and play music and drumming, and they hold little stomp dances in their backyard. That's the Native American church, where you build a fire that's supposed to be the ancestral fire, and there's a drinking of a soup and a smoking of a peace pipe, and then you dance around singing this fire, singing these wonderful old ancient songs in the language, and your prayers go up on the smoke to the stars. It's very wonderful and beautiful, and so they do this in their backyard. But I really have loved knowing this family, and I've sort of become a member of the family. And Mr. Wildcat, the senior Mr. Wildcat, recently died, and that was a real pity. But the thing that I really get confused about with this Native work is whether it's really good enough. And I think it's rare that people stand up in front of other people and say that. But I say it because, and mainly I say it for the students for this week, because, you know, there are times when you're going to do work and it's just not good enough, or you're never quite sure it's good enough. And it depends on what your standards are. But we were even talking about a body of work that one student did, that now he's sort of dealt with it and he can put it away. And I think that's a really important conversation to have. So I'll keep photographing Native people, and I'm starting to do a lot more of this. But I have to say about this body of work, I've always been very confused, and my fear is that it's never good enough. And I think it's because in the end, people don't really want to look at pictures of Native people unless they wear feathers. So I have this, you know, sort of battle constantly in my head, but it's a very interesting existential argument to have with oneself. I've also, throughout my career, done a lot of portraiture. I really love to do portraiture. I think it's very interesting, and to be honest, a lot of my Haiti work before I got grants was supported by portraiture, especially business portraiture. And this is where it's really wonderful, and I appreciate picture editors and what they do, because you might show your work to a picture editor at a magazine, and I love working for magazines. I have no apologies to make. Magazines are my venue. I love them. I always want to work for magazines. It's nice to have shows in the galleries, and I've had a lot of exhibitions. And of course, I have a book, and I love to do books as well, but I love magazines. So a lot of people who couldn't necessarily publish my Haiti work would give me assignments to, and that was their way of supporting it. And you know, I really appreciated that. And I've done a lot of portraiture for the New Yorker, and this was a man who's building libraries, a Vietnam vet, an American veteran of the Vietnamese War, who has gone back and single-handedly raised money to build a library, a national library system throughout Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And he was visiting a blind school where he was going to build a new school and a new library and a new dormitory for these little blind orphans. And anyway, for a while I was doing a lot of work for the New Yorker as portraiture. This is a couple of detectives who work with young boys at risk. And this was a woman who, a police officer who was the first woman chief, I guess, of a precinct in Harlem. And here's Dr. Death. He's a mortician, and I love, by the way, sort of working and photographing in morgues. I probably should have been a medical examiner, but I really liked him, and he sort of reminded me of that. But I just really love doing portraiture, and I really enjoy it. I guess I said that about 6 times. I've also had the very good fortune to work for National Geographic magazine a lot. Now, really the Geographic has given me a life I never sort of expected to have. Well, photography has given me a life I never expected to have, but the Geographic especially. And I never think of the work I do for the Geographic as art or anything. I always feel like I'm sort of lucky to get any kind of good picture at all. And I sometimes fall into thinking these pictures are sort of cute, but don't ask me why. So this is, I'm just going to show you sort of a little random selection of National Geographic greatest hits. This is a story I did in Dubai. And I really am fascinated by Dubai. I've done some other work there on the newspaper. This is a gentleman who's building the world's tallest building. This was the 44th floor. It took me 3 months to arrange to get this picture. But he was a very charming man. And this was a wedding. At a wedding, now when you have a wedding, a traditional wedding in Dubai, the men have their wedding in public, but the women have their weddings behind closed doors. But because I was a Western woman, an infidel, I suppose, I could photograph it and be there. And this is the stock exchange in Dubai, and I just love the little barefoot. And the opening of a new polo ground. The second story I ever did for National Geographic was on Miami, which is where I live now. And I lived there for 6 months. This was when we really had a lot of time to work on stories. And so I just loved going around Miami and sort of doing a lot of street shooting. These were 2 little Cuban boys who were watching a fire. You know, it's so interesting because it's really important sometimes when you're shooting pictures to turn around and look at what's behind you, because quite often it's much more interesting than what's in front of you. And I met these people, these nice ladies. I went to a church on the Sunday before Easter to ask if I could photograph Easter Sunday, and a lady named Sister Mickens came up to me and she said, "Honey, we're going to have an Easter hat party at my house. Would you like to come and photograph that? And I said, oh, you betcha. Oh, I sound like Sarah Palin. Oh, dear. I said, yes, I would love to do that. And so I went, and we sat with the ladies, and we had pigs in a blanket and punch. And then they opened up the curtain. Behind the curtain in the dining room were these tables that were groaning with Easter hats. And so I photographed it, and I had one of the most wonderful times, most wonderful days in my life. And I went out with the cops a lot and sort of trying to photograph neighborhoods, pockets of Miami that were very poor and maybe a little bit dangerous. And of course, Miami used to be called God's waiting room. And because everybody retired there, everybody in America, and sometimes in Europe, I suppose, went and retired there. And this was my idea of how Barbie would look when she retired in Miami. Now Miami, of course, is very vibrant. It's very young. It's mostly Latin. It's very exciting, very exciting. And then I did a story that was very close to my heart on the history of the African slave trade. And that's a very difficult, these historical stories are very difficult because you're photographing something from the past, but you can always see what's left. So on Gorée Island, which is in the harbor of Dakar in Senegal, this was a slaveholding post, and they still have shackles there as a reminder of that terrible part of human history. And in Ghana, tribal chieftains of villages where ancestors were stolen away and enslaved. Just a little boy getting a haircut. I love this little girl. I was in Angola, in Luanda, and Luanda was a remarkable European city that was completely destroyed by a long war. And it seemed very foreign to me to see African people in a sort of a European city, but I loved this little girl. And then in America, we still have the tradition of the rites of passage that came from Africa for young men, and the blessings in Candomblé in Brazil, and that sort of thing. The latest story I've done for the Geographic is a story on memory. And memory, too, is a very elusive thing to photograph. And so I tried to find ways to do that that would either really be a way to examine memory or also to evoke memory. This is a Cuban woman who fled Cuba as a little girl in a movement, an airlift called the Pedro Pan movement. And a lot of parents, right after Castro came to power, were very worried that their children would be taken from them. So hundreds of children were sent to the United States in airlifts that were organized by the Catholic Church. And the organization was called the Pedro Pan, or Peter Pan Airlift. And when this woman became old enough, she created an organization that sort of kept the Pedro Pan people together. But she can't go back to Cuba, but every day she swims in the sea between Cuba and Miami because these waters, it's a sea of memory, and these waters that touch the one shore also touch the other. This is a gentleman who contracted a virus that ate through his brain, and he lost his memory. At a facility in Portland, Oregon, a farmer who had no family and has no memory, but every day he goes out with his caretaker and they stand in the field and they decide what to plant for the season. I wanted very much to do, it's a sort of a science story, memory, and I wanted very much to do scientific pictures that didn't look like science, and I did a lot of research, and I found this Dr. Fernando Nottebohm, who is, I fell in love with him. I mean, not literally, but I was completely enamored with him and his work. Because he, for 30 years, has, as a little boy, he used to listen to the song of the bird. And as a scientist, he studied the ability of canaries to learn new songs and to repair their brain injuries because they have a little built-in toolkit. And through that research, they're trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's and dementia in we humans. So I wanted to do a picture that really sort of spoke to his work and that would also celebrate the sacrifice made by the Canaries, even though they absolutely have no say in it, but you know. And also to make a picture that would be like a fleeting memory. And we built a whole big cage and we worked for 2 days to get this picture. So it seems like a very simple picture, but anyway, but I love the picture because I love Dr. Nottebohm and the little canaries. And this is an American soldier who went to Iraq and came back completely paralyzed. And I was very moved by this couple because they were still very much in love, even though they can't manifest that love physically any longer. And so I wanted to photograph them, and I just was talking to them, and suddenly the young wife looked up, and she just, I was so moved by the look in her face as though she were remembering, and she did. And I thought this was a very interesting forensic artist who would go in, usually was called into murder cases and crimes to try to extract the memories of people who had suffered some criminal act. And by the time she was called in, usually the police had grilled somebody to the point where they didn't know if they were coming or going. And so she would talk to people about how an experience felt and what was the shape of it, and was there a color that came to mind. And she would manage to pull these extraordinary memories from their subconscious and draw the picture. And in fact, it was she, if you remember, there was the Unabomber case. It was she who actually drew the likeness of the Unabomber, and it was in fact exactly what he looked like from these witnesses who had seen or heard from him. So I was trying to find a way to express how do you draw out fractured memories. And we were sort of walking around the town where she lives in Arizona, and we happily discovered this hotel that had this fractured mirror in it, and so I did this picture. And these are brains, and you know, there's a lot of brain banks in the US, and there's all of these pickled brains, and I called about 20 of them, trying to get them, anyone who would take some of the brains. They have more brains than they need. But I wanted a slice of a normal brain and a slice of a brain that had, of someone who had died from Alzheimer's disease, which is the memory loss. And I only found one place that would do it, and it was in California, at the University of California. And I spent a whole day photographing these 2 slices of brains. I got to be very intimate with these brains, I want you to know. And I photographed them every which way, but you know, upside down. And finally we went with a very simple picture because the brains themselves really are devastating, and they tell a story. So the bottom brain is a normal brain, but the top brain shows you what happens when you have Alzheimer's. And around the edges of the brain, it becomes very tattered and torn. And then Alzheimer's is a disease that you actually die from. Dementia is sort of just old age memory loss, but Alzheimer's is really something you die from, and usually more quickly than from dementia or old age. But you can't really diagnose it until the person dies and you do a brain autopsy. But as you see, what happens is that basically these fingers drill through the brain, and parts of the brain disappear, and they become filled with liquid. And there are little plaques that are like little, very thin sheets that do not allow a synapse of a memory is an electric charge, actually, and they do not allow the charge to leap from one side to the other in your brain. And so this is what it looks like. So out of that, and while I was working on this story, every time I work on a National Geographic story, I always do a little story for myself, and that is more of a little playtime for me. When I was working in Miami, I used to look for everything that was pink and blue, because Miami's colors are pink and blue. And I did a whole little series of pink and blue pictures, and of course the magazine didn't want to have anything to do with it, but nonetheless. So when I was photographing memory, And my own mother has dementia and is struggling, I along with her, struggling through this. I decided I wanted to do some pictures that would feel like the landscape of memory. If we were taking a walk through memory, if we were looking at your memories or my memories, and to sort of make some images or look for images that would sit in our minds, that might remind us of something, that might provoke something in us to remember. So this is what I came up with. Well, this is just a weird picture, so I like this, but that's the memory box. You see the brain is the memory box. So I'm not going to talk over these. I'm just going to let you have your own memories. So that is that. And I did just want to say one more thing. This week I've really been encouraging the students to dream, because this is sort of the time in their life that there may not be a time later to dream. And I really think that they should dream very big. At the same time, to be balanced, that they have to be very, very practical if they're going to be photographers. But I have always thought this about dreams. Dreams are where creativity and intellect meet and reside, and the byproduct should be ideas. Ideas are really what are going to take you forward. If you don't have ideas, then really nothing will propel you forward, because that above anything, you can be a great photographer, but if you don't have ideas, and I don't mean one idea a year, I mean constantly ideas, because this is really the currency of making a living as a photographer. If you are going to be an art photographer, even there you have to have ideas. If you're going to be a photographer who wants to be exhibited in galleries, you still have to have ideas. Ideas are the currency of this business. And it's just really important to understand that. And the places that you find ideas is from talking to people, from exploring, and I still think from looking at newspapers and looking at magazines and looking at books and looking at old books and old photographs and reading literature. Literature is so important. If you don't read literature, whether it's your own culture or some foreign culture, you will never really understand other cultures and other people and the dreams of other people and the imaginations of other people. So I always think we can be introspective to a degree, but then we really have to open up and be out. And then the last thing I want to say is this, that really we are born just to die. And in this very brief time that we have on Earth, we can decide to do something with it. And we shouldn't waste the time. We can do something really beautiful and really great. And that's what we should dedicate our lives to, I think. And so thanks so much for coming and listening to me go on and on about Much Ado, but thanks so much. That's all I have to say.